Welcome, everybody, to this installment of the interview series that we're doing for Hope 1111. And this one I am calling the New Economy Panel. And this is one where my inner geek comes out, really. So I have studied, circular economy and the natural step and regenerative economy concepts for so long that I am so honored and so thrilled to have two people with me today that are deeply steeped in this world and and up to date on the latest thinking and the latest feeling around what kind of an economy can we create that evokes a longing so strong that we actually want to create it, so delicious that it actually drives us towards creating that. And so we're going to be exploring some assumptions around the current economy and why we're so locked into this is the only way, and then look at how can we transition to this new economy and what will that look like. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And so let me introduce you to our two guests today. So first, I have with me Della Duncan, who calls herself a renegade economist. She hosts opportunities for personal and systemic transition to a more equitable and sustainable and enlivened world. She's the host of the Upstream podcast, a right livelihood coach, an Atlantic Fellow of Social and Economic Equity at the International Inequalities Institute, at the London School of Economics, a gross national happiness master trainer. I love that one. A work that reconnect facilitator and a regenerative economics consultant. She's currently studying to be an engaged Buddhist Dharma teacher. She holds an MA in economics for transition with distinction from Schumacher College. And she holds a graduate certificate in authentic leadership. She has completed Joanna Macy's work that reconnects intensive programs, and all around is what I would call a beautiful Renaissance woman. And I am so delighted to have you here, Della. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And then also with us is Richard Heinberg of the Post-Carbon Institute. He has authored 13 books. As you can see behind him, he is a voracious reader and a scholar. And some of his seminal works have included the 2016 Our Renewable Future, which he co-authored with David Fridley, and in 2011, The End of Growth, Adapting Our New Economic Reality. He is a senior fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute and is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He has authored scores of essays and articles, and is a prolific speaker, has spoken to audiences in 14 countries, addressing policymakers at all levels. He's a recipient of the M. King Hubbard Award for Excellence in Energy Education and was appointed to His Majesty the King of Bhutan's International Expert Working Group for the New Development Paradigm Initiative. Welcome, Richard. It is truly an honor to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with both of you.
Yeah, you've been, as I told you yesterday, one of my heroes and people I have studied for a while. So I really love that you're here and that you're going to be sharing your wisdom with our audience. I think, this work that both of you have been doing sort of behind the scenes in a lot of ways, we've all been laboring behind the scenes to really create this world that we want to live in. And I believe our time has come. I believe the time has come for these thoughts, this line of thinking, this memory into the future that we want to live in to come into being. So I'm really excited. But let's start with going back and really taking a look at why is it so hard for us to let go of the current economic system and this need for incessant growth that really, when you step back and think about it, is truly actually insane on a finite planet. You know, and you talk about efficiency, just not being able to keep up with that. But let's just explore a little bit. Why are we so stuck on this growth focused capitalistic system as the only system we believe is going to help us to survive and thrive? So Richard, I'll start with you on that question.
Part of it is just the story of fossil fuels. I mean, when we discovered fossil fuels, we suddenly had access to energy sources that were tens of millions of years of ancient sunlight focused and transformed into materials that could energize all kinds of machines and productive processes, including agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, and so on. So it turned out we could make a lot more stuff using fossil fuels than we were accustomed to buying. You know, before the fossil fuel era, most people worked the lands. You know, 80% of people were farmers, and a few people lived in town, and they were, you know, bankers or whatever. But with fossil fuels making agriculture so much more productive, suddenly we had a growing middle class, people moving to town, getting jobs in manufacturing, and we could make just enormous amounts of stuff. And the problem then was overproduction. This is one of the factors that led to the Great Depression. So we solved the problem of overproduction in a couple of different ways. With advertising, the advertising industry ballooned to talk people into wanting more stuff than they realized they needed. Another aspect of this was consumer credit, which also expanded dramatically to enable people to consume now and pay later. So the amount of debt outstanding grew dramatically and has continued to grow ever since. Now, this was a project of industry, but it was also a project of government, especially during and after the Great Depression. So citizens came to be thought of as consumers, and it was our job to go out there and buy as much stuff as we could to keep overproduction from being a problem, to make sure everybody would have a job, to make sure that manufacturers would make a profit and investors would make a profit, and to make sure that as the economy continued to grow and grow and grow, tax revenues to government would also grow so that the government could provide more services. Everybody was a winner. And so the idea of economic growth, which really didn't even exist prior to the Great Depression, suddenly became, the be all and end all of the economy. I mean, the economy wasn't even a recognizable entity prior to that time. There were no monthly and annual statistics on unemployment and GDP and all of this. But suddenly, the economy is everything, and growth is its be all and end all. And the way we track it is with GDP. So that's how we got here. And it's a merry-go-round that once it got started, it's really hard to get off of it.
Yeah. Well, you just said everyone was a winner, and I would say
not everyone,
right? The Earth, for instance, was not a winner in this. And Della, I'd love you to come in, really speaking to that side of it a little bit. It's this myth of growth and not taking care of the entire system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, one thing that comes to mind to your original question, I think about economics as well as a discipline. And I think about how Adam Smith, when he was one of the parents of economics, he was in the realm of moral philosophy. He was a moral philosopher. And economics was in the Department of Moral Philosophy. So, it kind of, economics took a journey from that time to now where it really has become more of a science, even considered the dismal science, for example. So much more quantitative and much more numeric based. This isn't to at all, say that the math and the scientific part of economics is wrong or bad. It's more just, what if we could ask these questions that you're asking, Kirsten, about ethics and morals and values, and what about the planet and the well-being of the more than human world. So yeah, I think this thinking about economics as more of a science and a math, and really looking to the quantitative and trying to find easy ways to identify success and progress in a numeric sense, instead of maybe another view would be systems thinking, can be very difficult to measure complexity, right? It's very difficult to see, and also to think about values and other ways of measuring progress. So yeah, I just want to add to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point there, and that's this whole notion of valuation. And I think, as we come out of the Cartesian era of breaking everything down into its smallest parts and assigning that an economic value, I think we're also seeing the shortfalls of that kind of a thinking, because, we've degraded the ecosystem and nature down to how can it be valuable from an economic perspective? How much can I get for a tree that will ultimately become boards for a house? And notions like that are really not taking into account the systemic value, the ecosystem value of the whole. And so this notion of measuring everything just from an economic perspective is so detrimental. Is there something, Richard, that you can add to that?
Well, I wanted to go back to something that Della said about economic theory, how it originated as a branch of moral philosophy. And I would argue that economics really still is moral philosophy. It's just been dressed up with a lot of equations and numeracy. Because take the proposition of ownership of land. I mean, nobody makes land, it's just here. But we have laws, we have a moral philosophy that says, you can own land, you can go out and buy some land, and maybe it has coal or oil underneath it. And once you've bought it, you can extract that coal and oil, and you get the profit, and society cleans up the mess. Wait a minute, theoretically, that's all just economics, it's all just numbers, but there's an enormous amount of, moral philosophy behind that. That's actually just, benefiting a few people at the detriment of lots of other people, future generations, other species, and so on. Shouldn't we be able to rethink that moral bargain and do a little bit better?
Well, and I think that hooks into what we believe is that in order to make this shift, we're going to have to make a leap in our awareness. That moral compass, I think, comes from something deeper than just saying, okay, here's now our new morality, because, we are so individualized in this country. And it's like, I get to do what I want to do. And that doesn't work when you're not seeing the whole system, and it keeps coming back to that ability to see yourself as part of, not individual from. And that's just, to me, one of those core principles of how a new economy has to be built. So let's shift a little bit then into what are some of the myths that people hold that keep them from believing we can shift into a regenerative economy. What are some of them? And you can popcorn this if you want. What are some of those myths that we get to bust here today? Richard, you want to start?
Well, this idea of private ownership of land and what sometimes we call natural capital is is certainly one of them. And the very idea of economic growth and the necessity of it is another. Then the notion that debt is something normal and natural, and we want to monetize everything. I mean, this has been the direction that we've been going over the last few decades. You know, we want more GDP, which means we want more money flowing through the economy. How do you do that? You monetize more and more stuff. But as you monetize more and more of human experience and nature, then you're shrinking the commons. You know, when we lived as hunter-gatherers for, you know, tens and hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in a gift economy where we just shared everything, and everybody, you knew everybody, and collective survival was the primary object of everybody's experience. Now, everything is owned, everything is for sale, everything is measured. We sell our time on the installment plan by getting jobs, and everything is an economic transaction. Are we better off because of that? I would argue, you know, we've lost a tremendous amount of our psychological and moral and spiritual sanity in the process of monetizing everything. But we assume that's one of those assumptions that we just carry around with us. Nobody wants to question.
Yeah, and another assumption to piggyback off of that is just what is progress and what is, you know, the good life, what is development. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Rob Hopkins once, the founder of the Transition Town movement, one of the founders. He said to me, you know, I want my son to grow. I do. I want my son to grow to a certain height, and then I want him to stop growing, and I want him to grow in other ways. And so there's this assumption built in about progress and success at all levels. At the individual level, it's how much money do we make. As a coach, sometimes I work with someone who's going from one job to another job, and it's the same pay scale. It is called a lateral move. Even if it brings their life so much more, you know, richness and well-being to their health and happiness, it's seen as lateral because of that income as one of the key indicators of success or progress. At the business level, the growth of profit, obviously. And then, as Richard has pointed out, at the societal or nation state level, the growth of gross domestic product is that number. And so one of the assumptions to address or to tackle is what is progress? What is progress for us as individuals? What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean for a business to be successful, or an enterprise or an organization? And then also as a society, as a global economy, and as a nation state economy, what would success look like? So it's really an assumption around changing the goal. And I love, Richard, that you and I both have this connection to Bhutan. That's wonderful. And I'm reminded of a quote from Dr. Havin To. He's one of he worked at the Gross National Happiness Center there in Bhutan. And he said, we are attentive to what we measure. We are attentive to what we measure. So I think one way to break that assumption is to say, what are we measuring for success, and what could we measure differently? What else could we look towards to know about the health and the richness of our own lives, of our lives together, of our enterprises and organizations, and then our global economy?
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's where we get to start unraveling a little bit what is tied to our self-worth and our self-image. And, you know, so much right now is tied to having things, being something in the in the career ladder. And it's all these external indicators of success. And I think, you know, along with, you know, running against the cliff with climate change and, you know, ecosystem collapse and such, I think we're seeing that same cliff internally with human beings right now. And the stress levels, the anxiety levels, the unhappiness levels, and you're seeing these little studies where, you know, rather than getting a bonus, they get some wonderful perk that enhances them as human beings. That's what people will choose in companies more than extra money now. And it's these little touch points that go, oh, maybe there's something other than the monetary reward that is driving us forth. And I think we're seeing that as people feel more lonely in this society, and long for community. Community would be a much, much more enriching experience than being lonely at home in front of the computer making, maybe, $1,000 more a month, and I think those are some of the things that we're really running up against right now. And we'll invite a reassessment of who we are as people. So I would love both of you to just, I did interview Rob Hopkins. So, and his new book is the From What Is to What If. And it's all about imagination. It's about imagining, opening up imagination to what it is that we truly want. So based on both of your expertise in what it could look like, I would like you to just speak to what a regenerative economy would look and feel like, so that we can open up the field of possibilities to our audience. So Della, I'm going to kick that one to you first.
Yeah, well, I'm reminded there's these two feminist economics writers who write together under the name Gibson Graham, and they talk about how we actually perform different economies all the time, like multiple economies. And so they say that, capitalism is just one economy that we perform. And actually, there's many other economies that we perform in our lives simultaneously. So it's almost, what I guess my way to answer that question is, there are seeds that I would water in what already is, right? In the regenerative economy. So, and even just seeing economics in this way, that we already participate in gift economies, sharing economies, caring economies, local community economies all the time. And so my kind of vision for the future would be to uplift and support and water those economies so that we're more embedded in them and they're more healthy and flourishing. And the more extractive economies, the capitalist enterprises that are non-democratic or exploitative, that those would decrease. So just to share that. So yeah, it would, for me, the vision would be a place where we have more cohesive communities, where we have much more interactions that are off the market and non-monetized, as Richard was saying. So much more mutual indebtedness, where we're supporting one another and collaborating. And then also a much deeper relationship with the more than human world. A much closer connection to place, both ancestral, but also and cultural, but also ecosystem. So knowing our seasons, knowing our plants and animals, and how that and the waterways. I'm in San Francisco right now, and I'm just thinking about what waterways are beneath these sidewalks, right? And what are the native plants and trees to support and create more thriving ecosystems, that our human systems could be nested within. So yeah, it would be an uplifting of already regenerative practices around the world and even where we are. I think that would be how I'd answer that question.
Do me a favor before we go to Richard, just define briefly what you mean by economy. What do we mean when we say we want a different economy?
Yeah, so I think economies, I would say, like this view of performing diverse economies. So we have different economies. Like when I take care of an elderly parent, that's the caring economy. When I offer a ride to my neighbor, that's the sharing economy. When I go into a cooperative bookstore, cooperative grocery store, that's the cooperative economy. So I see economies as ways of our acting and behaving, and also places and also systems, right? That cooperative bookstore is in a particular system of how they're making decisions, of how they're figuring out their supply chains, et cetera. So yeah, I would say that is how I would define economies. I would say I definitely like to take the economy away from being something outside of us and far away and abstract and something that we leave to the quote unquote economists, right? And instead seeing economics as something we participate in, we embody, and we practice on a day-to-day level. So actually there are many economies that we've already practiced and performed and embodied today. So how can we embody and participate in the more ecological and thriving economies that we want to see? We can do that already today in our lives.
I mean, really, isn't it an exchange of our gifts and talents and contributions to the larger whole that starts the process of forming an economy? And how
Absolutely.
we do that is what we're really up against right now.
Yeah, thank you. And I am broadening. I'm saying that not just what is monetized is in the economy. Yes. I'm definitely saying our participation, our collaboration, our contribution, that too is part of economies. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, lovely. Richard.
Yeah, well, economies arise from our relationship with nature. I mean, a standard economic theory would say the economy is a way of distributing goods and services within society. Boring, but that is always rooted in our relationship with nature, whether it's a hunter-gatherer economy or a horticultural economy or an agricultural agrarian economy or a fossil-fueled industrial economy. And each of those carries all kinds of assumptions and incentives and disincentives with it. We're getting to the end of a certain kind of economy. You know, the fossil fueled industrial economy isn't going to continue to the end of this century. I mean, we know that. We don't know exactly what's going to replace it. You know, some of us have some ideas, but this is going to be a process of discovery for all of us. So we should be dreaming and imagining big. I mean, what really matters to us? Everybody wants to be secure. You know, we don't want the economy to fall apart in such a way that every, you know, massive numbers of people are left destitute or, competing over scarce resources. But what do we want? Well, what makes life worth living? It's community. It's a sense of fellow feeling, which we talked about. It's also beauty. Evolution is driven by power, and the power of, whether it's the power of flight or the power of, being a more efficient predator or whatever. But evolution is also driven by beauty. I mean, we look at nature and it's not just all red and tooth and claw. It's beautiful. Plants learn to evolve flowers. And why? To be attractive to insects and birds. And birds sing and dance all the time. Why? Because they've evolved that way, because it serves the purpose of their reproduction and success as species. In the process of monetizing everything, we've squeezed out a lot of what makes life beautiful and worth living just because it couldn't be quantified and it couldn't be monetized. I mean, right now, with the pandemic, we have performing artists, creative artists out of work and all over the planet. I mean, for the arts, this has just been catastrophic. But even in the best of times, the arts are kind of this ornament that we add on to society. But what if beauty was the main organizing principle of our economy? That sounds absurd. I mean, it's just so unpractical. But in fact, that's what motivates us. And if we were to start thinking that way and organizing our lives and our communities that way, what a beautiful world this could be.
Yeah. And I always like inviting people to just feel into what that would feel like. What would it feel like to walk down your neighborhood street to your little downtown and feel the vibrancy of that kind of a community, that is based on beauty, that is based on creativity and imagination, that is based on connectivity And you know, that's really what we want to evoke here. I think, you know, and that came out so strongly in my interview with Rob, is like, we have got to ignite our imagination to be able to feel into what would it feel like, and do I prefer feeling like that in you know, in a connected community, or, you know, this disconnected, tech oriented, isolated, monetized way of being? You know, what feels better? Okay, if the connected community feels better, then let's see what we need to do in order to create that. And, you know, I find it interesting. You just said, you know, we don't want the economy falling apart. And I completely agree with that. And if there were a system in place, an ecosystem in place where communities were connected, then a falling apart economy wouldn't be so terrifying, and it wouldn't be so existential for people, because there would be a net that would catch everybody, you know. And that's why, you know, I think it's so panic invoking when the economy is just slightly threatened, because we're all alone, you know, we're in our little isolated families. And I think the thing that I always go back to is designing like an ecosystem, you know, and really thinking like an ecosystem. So let's go through some of those principles of, you know, how does an ecosystem think? You know, what are some of the core principles of a stable, flexible, resilient ecosystem? So, you know, I wrote some down, but I'd love to hear from you guys, you know, and thinking, you know, ecosystem to economy. You know, if we think like an ecosystem in the way we can design an economy, we can make massive headways. So what are some of those core principles of a healthy, resilient ecosystem? Richard?
Well, I can go first.
Yep.
In an ecosystem, there's no waste, because waste from one part of the ecosystem is food for some other part. And we have created, of course, an economy in which there's an enormous amount of waste, and it's toxic waste, plastics and petrochemicals of all kinds, minerals that we extract from the Earth's crust that we're doing, you know, they were just fine where they were, but now we put them into products and those wear out, and we throw those into landfills or they go down waterways into the ocean, and pollution is really a very serious deal. Of course, the worst instance of pollution is carbon emissions and climate change, but that's certainly not the only one. So we need a circular economy, and the only way we get there is to start really seeing the connections between everything. In current economic theory, there's what's called externalities, things that are not factored into the price that you pay
Convenient
for a product or service, and that society, it ends up having to clean up later, if it even gets cleaned up at all. So all externalities have got to be internalized, so we're actually paying the true cost of resource extraction and waste dumping. So that's just one thing.
Nice. Yeah. And, you know, and again, quoting Rob Hopkins in asking good questions, what if we had an economy where there was absolutely zero waste? Everything was reused, stayed in the technosphere, and never, ever, ever made it into the ecosystem. That's, you know, a really good question that can spur a lot of creativity. Della.
Yeah, another one that comes to mind is just the cycles of nature in an ecosystem. So I'm thinking about the seasons and how, you know, if we look at an economy, there would be a summer, maybe like a growth time, but then there could also be a harvesting time, the fall, and then a time of more like death or reflection or quieting or stillness. And I just think about, when I think about the seasons, I think about people's daily life, like how funny it is that we think that we ought to be the same amount of productive every day or grow in our productivity, when actually there's times when we want to sleep more or hibernate or reflect more. So looking at seasonality to organizations, I know some organizations that have taken a winter, which I really love, or even just the concept of sabbatical, that time of rest or reflection, but also just our own bodies, our own lives. So I think looking at seasons and productivity differently, and valuing stillness and rest, and also understanding that things die or decay, that too can be a principle we can look at in our economic systems.
I love that you brought that in. You know, I'm a pattern girl, and I think patterns is one of the ways that can inform us, and seasons is a pattern and can inform design. So thank you for presencing that one. I did not have that one on my list.
Well, closely related to that is the idea of the adaptive cycle, which is resilience science as a branch of ecology came up with this observation that all ecosystems pass through a series, a kind of cycle, growth and stabilization, and then usually, almost always, I guess always, something comes along to disturb that stable pattern, and a lot of the resources that had been drawn into that ecosystem are released. And after that release phase, there's reorganization, and the whole thing goes again. And human societies are like that too. I mean, if you look back through history, and there are historians now who do this in a quantitative way and have huge databases about hundreds of past societies, and analyzing them according to all kinds of criteria, and it's very clear they pass through cycles over time of growth and then shrinkage. Our society has grown maybe too much, and so we're facing what may be a pretty challenging period of reorganization, shrinkage and reorganization. Well, how can we understand that, make the most of it, build resilience so that we don't lose what's most important to us during the process of reorganization? I think that's a really valuable concept, at least that I found in ecology.
Yeah.
And one answer to that is diversity, which I know that is one of the principles, Kirsten, that you brought up. But yeah, if we think about that ecosystem going through that phase, if it's a monocrop, right? If it's just one type of plant, then it's very brittle. It's not very resilient, and it could die. But if we have diversity in the ecosystem and multiple functions that are happening, and relationships, lots of relationships, then we have that diversity building resilience. And sometimes I think about this in my own life or in individuals' life of, income generating or projects, right? If the more projects and relationships, personal, but also maybe work things that we're doing, then if one of them falls through, we can be more resilient in our lives, kind of not putting all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. So yeah, I think diversity and resilience have a natural connection there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. Diversity is such an important aspect to a resilient ecosystem. For me, where that really hit home, I mean, we're seeing it for one right now in what's happening globally through this pandemic, and how it's cut our supply chains, broken those, and all of a sudden we don't have the diversity in this country to really supply all of our needs, and our manufacturing is hurting. So I think that's one of the ways in which we can see how easy something can be broken when it's not diverse. But I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the ways that we're going to have to deal with that is relocalization of our economies, because right now we depend on, as you say, these long supply chains, globalization. And that depends upon giant organizations and cheap transport fuels and all of the stuff that may not be around for forever, certainly, or very much longer. And so we need to relocalize our economies, and there are lots of benefits that could be achieved in doing that. You know, you could get to know the people who are providing the goods and services for you rather than just, you know, pushing a button and having Amazon deliver it to your door. You know, what kind of life is actually going to make you happier in the end, pushing buttons or knowing and interacting with people?
Yeah. No, I that was on my list. Localization is such an important one, and I think we're seeing that push more and more. I heard the story on the news where, you know, milk producers, the really big milk producers, were suddenly hurting because, you know, the supply chain was broken for the restaurants. Let's say, you know, they were still giving milk to the stores, but everything else basically fell into a black hole. And so they started offering, almost in a little, like a mini market, they would deliver milk locally. And all of a sudden they started knowing their neighbors, and there was that connection, that vibrancy. And you know, they interviewed a few of these milk farmers, and they were just, you could tell there was something that livened, even though there was a scariness about, you know, losing that much income. All of a sudden there was more of this connection to the local economy. Yeah, Della, what have you found in terms of this localization movement and how that fits into a regenerative economy?
I think it connects with what you were saying about, like, if we feel. Can you hear me?
Can you hear her?
Your volume was way down.
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Something happened.
Still,
yeah, you sound like you're far away.
Hear me now?
Yeah, it's not corrected yet.
Okay, you go ahead, Richard. I'll try to problem solve.
Yeah, so Richard, so why don't we go deeper into the localization question, because I think it is so essential.
I'm glad you used the example of the farmers and or the dairymen and the milk, because food is really where we need to begin this process of localization, because food is, first of all, it's the essence of culture. It's the basis of the economy, as we were saying earlier. It all comes up from our relationship with nature, and we eat food at least, you know, 3 times a day. So it's something that we're intimately connected with. We enjoy it. It's food is beautiful. It gives life, and if we want to have a vibrant local food economy, that means getting to know your local farmers and making sure that young people who want to go into farming have some access to land. And that's a big problem right now, because there are whole networks of young people who want to become farmers. And the biggest obstacle that's facing them is access to land. And guess who owns all of that land? People of my generation, the baby boomers, who got it all locked up, who, you know, for whatever reason, whether they're CEOs of big agribusiness corporations, or, you know, they have inherited land or whatever, there's the ownership of land in this country has really gotten, you know, into just a very few hands, and that needs to change. Whether it's the ownership or the access, somehow we have to make it possible for young people to go into what is one of the most honorable occupations and ancient occupations there is, which is producing food for the community.
Della, what are your thoughts on localization and how important that is to a regenerative economy?
Can you hear me now?
It's better.
Wonderful. Yep. So one thing that comes up, and I'm sure, Richard, you may even know more about this, but I'm thinking about community energy. So community renewable energy ownership models. And so I was actually evacuated in one of the fires here in California, and the power was out for a long time. And a few folks said, you know, it wouldn't have been interesting
interesting had we had more of our own solar panels, either community owned or, locally owned. So I'm inspired by groups like People Powered Solar is one in Oakland, California, where they have a community ownership model of solar. So the community kind of as a cooperative buys the solar panels, helps to install them on people's roofs, and households get to use it, even if they're renters or they're owners. And then the profits of the renewable energy going back to the grid, the excess, is then shared amongst the people who are the members. So yeah, just inspired by also, the alternative energy forms and community energy in particular. I'm sure you know more about that, Richard, but just wanted to add that.
No, that was you said it, and I was intrigued by something else you said, which was talking about being evacuated from wildfires. And of course, up here in Santa Rosa, where I live, we've had wildfires the last 3 years, and we've evacuated a couple of times. The power goes out, or PG&E turns it off. This is actually an opportunity, I think, because we're facing more disasters, more kinds of disasters, floods, droughts, fires, earthquakes, you name it. With climate change already in the pipeline, we are going to be facing more disasters and catastrophes of various kinds. When you're actually in one, you realize that your neighbors are really important. They're not just people who happen to live on either side of you. These are the people with whom you're going to collaborate in making it through this tough experience. So building neighborhood networks, find out who in your neighborhood, who are the elderly people in your neighborhood who need to be, make sure that they're okay before you evacuate, or who has a backyard garden, who does have solar panels and batteries, who could help out, in terms of, providing maybe internet access during a time when the grid is down. It's crisis, but it's also an opportunity to rebuild community at the most local level. So disaster preparedness is actually something I'm very interested in this, and I think there's a lot of good work going on in this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only other thing then, and this fits into what you just said, is redundancy, as a principle in a resilient ecosystem. So if every person or 3 out of the 10 households have an alternative energy source, there is some redundancy there. And that will help strengthen the whole. And I think that's a really important aspect to that kind of a resilience. And I love what you just said, Richard, because this really brings us back to, who do we choose to be now? Do we want to stay the type of human being that is only focused on my own well-being at the expense of everybody else's and every system's else's? Or do we want to really evaluate who we choose to be and step back and look at what's really important? And so for these last few minutes of this interview, I really want to talk about, how do we get there? What is necessary for us as human beings to get there, and for the systems that need to shape shift or crumble in order for the new to come out. So Della, why don't you take us into that conversation?
Yeah, my favorite essay or mentor on this topic is Donella Meadows, a late systems thinker, and she has this essay called Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System. And she just ranks, places to intervene in a system to create this change that you're speaking about. And one of them that we spoke about earlier was changing the goal of the system, and so finding alternative measurement tools. I'm really inspired by Kate Rayworth and donut economics. How do we say, what if the goal of the economy was to meet human needs equitably while staying within the planetary boundaries? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of her alternative goal for economy, but also, as we've kind of touched upon, gross national happiness could be an alternative measurement. But yeah, how do we measure differently? And then one of the highest the second highest leverage point that Donella Meadows speaks about is changing our paradigm, our worldview. And I think we've also touched on that too. And I think one of them that I would add when we're thinking about ecosystems is that revaluing. So just seeing the more than human world as having intrinsic value beyond our usefulness to humans. And really, as you're saying, being in relation with the more than human world and seeing that interconnectedness as having inherent value. So just that changing our minds, rethinking, and shifting our paradigm to something more ecological, as we're speaking about, and also more interconnected, more harmonious. So I would just add those.
Nice. Richard?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, agree with all of that. And we need to start building those alternative structures arising from our more connected worldview. We need to do that before crisis hits. And we're kind of running out of time in that regard. So don't waste any time at all in doing the things that help to build a local economy that's also a cooperative economy, that's a circular economy. Anything you can do, whether it's, doing a compost pile in your backyard, or getting to know your neighbors, or finding out how's your local recycling. How's that accomplished? How's it done? What can you be involved in that in some way? These are just trivial examples, but we need to have big elements of this new economy in place before the old one really starts to come apart at the seams. The other thing I would mention, which we haven't talked about, it's a little bit tangential to here, but we have to mention it, is inequality. One of the reasons that the growth economy seemed to work was there was always this idea that even if some people are raking in millions and billions, even the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid will eventually benefit, as long as to mix metaphors, as long as the whole pie is growing. Maybe my slice is really small and maybe that person's slice is enormous, but if I can at least count on my piece of the pie growing a little bit because the whole pie is growing, then it's okay. I can live with that. But what happens when the whole pie starts to shrink? Then if some people are, again, raking in the billions, then it becomes a real problem. In a post-growth economy, the only way we're going to be able to get through this together with any kind of cohesive social fabric is if we systematically reduce the amount of economic inequality in society. So there are things we can do maybe at the local level, but it's really more the rules and disincentives and incentives at the national level that will need to tackle that. But that's a really big priority. We cannot have more billionaires and multi-billionaires. We need to make sure everybody's going to be okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate you presencing that. Just to bring it out and to understand. And, the word that I just wrote down was balance. Really one of the key aspects to moving into a more regenerative world is to be able to detect imbalances and to be in service of rebalancing. So what you're speaking to right now is a severe imbalance in the distribution of wealth. And people everywhere can feel it. I'm sure those that have the extreme wealth feel it too. But, this is now where it ties back into the self-worth and the need for power. And I know you're writing your new book on power and how that functions. And it's just, we have lost the ability to keep things in balance, be it on an environmental level, an internal level, on a societal level. And I think one of the markers of waking up more as a species, of making a leap in our awareness, is to be able to tune into when something is out of balance, and then making the steps to come back into balance, because that is one of the core principles of a thriving world. And, you know, this whole event, Hope 1111, is about understanding that, for instance, fear is way out of balance in the world right now. And it's not just a kind of a notion out here that fear is a dense energy, and it can have very detrimental effects on this world. It can lead to panic hysteria and, you know, world wars, really, if fear gets too intense. And so Hope 1111 is about balancing the fear. And so as we step into a regenerative economy, into a regenerative way of being, really, I'd almost like to tie it, you know, to honor what you said, Della, about this is not just monetary exchange or exchange of something external. This is about internal way of being as well. You know, we want to reach for the balance point and feel the balance in everything. So I could continue talking to both of you forever. I find this so fascinating and just such a rich thing. I mean, like, I just realized the thing that we never touched on that I just want to at least drop the pebble in is currencies, complementary currencies, you know, different ways of exchanging with each other that are not based just on the US dollar, you know, and how in crises those come out. You know, it's been shown in World War II how, you know, complementary currencies showed up in different regions in order to be able to exchange and such. So there's that whole world of conversation that we could go in, but can't.
And something I would add to that is the necessity of canceling an enormous amount of debt, because it can't all be repaid. We built up this huge burden of, I'm not talking about government debt, I'm talking about just student loans and all the rest, on the assumption that the economy would always grow and we'd always be able to pay it back. Well, we're coming to a time when that's not going to be realistically possible. So how do we systematically forgive an enormous amount of debt and minimize the difficulties that will cause?
Yeah.
So
and all that debt for the global South, right? To the ways that we've colonized the global South through monetary means. And so, yeah, a global debt jubilee. I'm all for it, Richard. Great idea.
Again, to me, that's a rebalancing act.
Yes,
let's come back to balance and look at how to design from a much more stable place. Because I mean, debt causes fear, which causes constriction, which causes no imagination, which causes us not to be able to move forward and create in a generative way. So it's just, as I said, we could go on forever. I so deeply appreciate both of your contributions and what you stand for in the world and how you serve. I deeply appreciate that. And I look forward to collaborating with both of you in the future as we, you know, continue to create the world we want to live in.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. It's been beautiful practicing hope with you on this call. Thank you.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, thank you both.